My name is Mike Lannon. I am from Tech Environmental. We're an air quality, odor control, noise, health and safety consulting firm. We were hired this summer to do an assessment of the landfill, and basically we've been doing air quality work since 1984 at this particular firm. We've examined air quality, odor data for dozens of landfills in the Northeast and many in Massachusetts. We've often been called in when there have been concerns about odors, and when there have been concerns about odors, people then tend to think, well, maybe there's associated air quality concern with that. So we're often called in when people have odor concerns to examine what the potential is for air quality concerns along with those odors. So basically, we put a team together for this project. I'm the officer, registered professional engineer. Dr. Dana Busky, who's over here, she's going to talk about the project. She was a project manager. She has a PhD from chemistry from MIT and does a lot of our risk work, risk comparisons. And we also involved Dr. Robert Rossi, who's a certified consulting meteorologist, to help with the dispersion modeling. Dana is really going to talk mostly about this project, but what I did want to just mention was our whole overall approach for this project was to try to minimize the cost for this by taking a real screening level effort and take as many conservatisms as we can to demonstrate whether or not there will be any health concern from this. And with many, many different conservatisms stacked on top of each other, you know, if you come to a point where you don't have a concern with those, then you're done. So that was the approach that we took for this project. And Dana's going to talk a little bit more about it, and I'll be here to help answer some of the questions.
Okay, the goal of our study was to determine whether the landfill gas emissions and sporadic odor complaints were a cause for concern with regard to human health in the area around the landfill. So this is just an overview slide where I'm going to briefly describe what we did in this project, and then I'll explain it in more detail on the upcoming slides. So the first step of our study was to sample gas emissions from what we call hot spots around the landfill. And those are areas of maximum emissions, localized areas of maximum. And this diagram shows a USGS map of the area. The rectangular area is the landfill. And then all the dots that you can see are they're called receptors. And those are the locations where the model is predicting the concentrations of the different pollutants. And what you do is you use real meteorological data that for five years of real meteorological data, and then you can get a sense of what the worst possible weather conditions could be, what your impacts would be. The next step is a comparison to the DEP health risk-based guidelines. And these are concentrations that a source of air pollution should not exceed to protect public health. And what we did is we did the comparison to the AALs. They're the allowable ambient air limits. Those are annual guidelines. And then the TELs are the threshold effects exposure limits, and those are 24-hour guidelines. Because these values are so conservative, and because we do a study that really takes the absolute worst emissions from very small areas of the landfill and projects them over the entire surface, this ends up being very conservative. So if you find an exceedance, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have a health risk. That just means that your study was too conservative and you have to go back and look at it more closely. But if you don't find an exceedance, then you know that there was no health risk. I know you can't read this, but this is just all the different compounds that we looked at that have AELs and TELs, the state guidelines. And we found that, none of the values were found over the TELs from our model. And in the next, and none of the values were over the AALs. So that means even though our model was very conservative, none of our results were over the state health guidelines for individuals in the general population, including people who are sick and the elderly and children.
In August and September, the DPW did a 3-second air grab on my property and found many nasties in the air, such as methyl ether ketone, methylene chloride, hexate. I think that you should be doing 24-hour volatile organic testing. Tech Environmental did their testing. We saw them there in the spring and summer when the weather was beautiful. On the properties, they just had hydrogen sulfide meters, not VOC meters. The VOC meters were only at the landfill, and they did modeling. We don't want modeling. Our lives are worth more than modeling. Why don't you do some real-time testing? I think you should try to put yourselves in the shoes of these families. We want to know what further plans will be applied to the situation, how much longer we have to suffer. This is a bad location for a landfill. It's on top of an aquifer and surrounded by homes. There has been seriously negative impacts from the landfill on everyone. I think the DPW has been short-sighted, and there are long-term water needs in the state, and I really would like you to reconsider the expansion. Thank you.
The grab samples that were taken on people's properties for odor complaints, my understanding is that the staff responding had hydrogen sulfide meters, but the sample itself was taken for VOCs. And all the levels of VOCs that were found in the samples that were taken in the neighborhood. We also took background samples as part of our study that were upwind from the landfill. And all of the levels were well below the state guidelines, which are for 24-hour exposure, so it's a longer period of time. But when you look at those samples, the levels of compounds detected were extremely low, and they're basically at levels that are considered background conditions. There was one sample that was taken at City Hall, and it found similar compounds at similar levels to those found during odor complaints. And I think a lot of times people don't think about the things that are in your air everywhere. A lot of the compounds we found are from car exhaust, from paints, from varnishes, from things that you find in your environment.
Yeah, there was also discussion about real-time testing, and the levels that we're talking about here, down in the part per trillion level, you can't really do that with a meter out in the field like that. It doesn't work. What you really need to do, your best way to predict what's going to happen is to try to capture a source number and then predict it off-site, which is what we did with taking samples at the landfill and then predicting those off-site. We're talking about taking samples in these cans and sending them into the lab to get part per trillion level, to try to put a real-time monitor out in the field. There just isn't one that exists today that you can put in somebody's yard to measure things. The way to do it is you have to take grab samples and send them to a laboratory where the environment is sterile and very controlled.
When we bought the house over 19 years ago, we spoke to the previous owner who had lived there for 10 years and said, we knew there was a dump down the road, and said, were there odors from it? And he said he'd never noticed any odors from it. I lived in that house, I've lived there now for over 19 years, and the odors were not, were, for me, extremely rare. I hardly ever noticed them years ago. And lately, with all this work that all of you folks have done and all the engineering, they're far worse. And I'm not right there, and I would like someone to explain to me why they are worse. Now, maybe, there's just been more garbage in there, it's been in there longer, the liner broke or whatever, but it's worse now than it ever was. And I don't understand that based on everything that I'm hearing here. And frankly, for the people who live there, I'm not, a doctor or an analyst or anything, but I think if you're smelling this stuff, especially those who live closer, and it's really intense and virtually every day, it is a major, major quality of life issue, whether there's a health consequence or not. And frankly, if I were smelling that all the time, that much, I don't think anyone here, any PhD or MD or anybody could convince me that there was no health consequence.
The other thing we've asked repeatedly, you're taking an air grab over a few seconds and you're comparing that level to a 24-hour level or an annual level. And that has to be done by some kind of equations.
No,
and I think that's...
No, we didn't compare it to annual numbers. We compared it to TDLs.
Yes, which are
And
a 24-hour
let me
guideline.
finish, okay? If it was odorous at the time when the sample was collected, that means that we're directly downwind of the landfill. Therefore, we're getting a peak event over a short period of time, okay? It is extremely likely, excuse me, pardon me, that during that 24 hours, the wind changes direction. I mean, there isn't a day that goes by where the wind doesn't change direction. So actually, that's more conservative to take that worst case number and then compare it to a 24-hour number than taking a 24-hour sample. Yes, you're absolutely right. You could use the 1/5 power law and project that short-term value over a longer period, because the 1/5 power law takes into account wind variability. But we didn't even do that here. We didn't need to do that here. It was low enough that it was fine the way it was.
Well, we're not going to agree on this because the landfill odors are profound. They carry with them VOCs, and I think that we're not going to agree on how adequate the testing was or wasn't.
Landfill odors, not VOCs.
I would appreciate it if Mike Gorski from the Mass DEP could answer my other questions. Thank you.
It's a horror story. We live it every day, and I'm sure there are many other people here who do as well. Thank you.
Jay Flatman, live in High Meadow Road in Florence, on the Board of Health. I don't live around the landfill, though I will say that I was down there recently and I was actually surprised of the smell of sulfur as I drove down Glendale Road over by Route 66, and so it's real. I'm not worried about embarrassing myself with a rather simple question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Making the assumption that the study that was done was an honest study and a professional study that didn't find anything that yielded any health risks, and then also making the assumption that the people in the community are really smelling something and they're not nuts. The question then becomes, what is it exactly that they're smelling? What's the source of it? And are there techniques available to ameliorate what's coming off, presumably the landfill, and causing the problem? And we have a number of engineers in the room and city officials, and I'm kind of curious as to the answers to those questions. Thank you.
So I think people often associate health effects with the odors they're smelling, and what our study helps to show is there really isn't an association between the health effects and the odors. That you can smell these odors, and yes, sometimes it is quite pungent, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a health effect, and in this case there really there isn't, because of the conservative samples that we took. You're probably smelling hydrogen sulfide, and it's really it creates a nuisance condition, which can create like a short-term health effect in some extreme cases, but it's not a long-term health effect from the odors.
If that's all that's coming off and bothering the community, then the next question, of course, then is how can you impact on that and ameliorate the effect of the people who live in the community and are smelling that in their houses and their garages and wherever else it is? Because it is, I mean, I was there, and again, I was surprised by how strong the smell was. Not having lived in the area, I hadn't had that experience.
So there's really two odors you can smell outside from the landfill, predominantly, not including a fresh garbage type odor. One of it's more like a rotten egg, which is the hydrogen sulfide, and one of it's more like a rotten cabbage kind of smell, and that's more of the methyl cabbage. Similar, but a little bit different. But again, the levels are very, very low, very low. And then the next question you had was, what can you do to mediate this? And I think some of it has to do with the fact that historically in this landfill, there is some older construction and demolition debris in this particular landfill that off-gas hydrogen sulfide at a higher level. Those cells are dying down and getting to be less, and the new fresh waste has much less potential for hydrogen sulfide. That's the first thing. The second thing, and what I've noticed from seeing a lot of landfills like this, and I'm sure you can attest to this too, is that basically EPA guidelines are to sink one vertical well on every acre. That's the guideline. Well, whenever you have a landfill gas to energy plant, clearly there's a large investment in installing the plant. So then it's an incremental cost to add more wells. And what I found is when you go to landfill gas to energy, there's an even greater advantage, there's a real good reason to collect as much gas as possible. So many times you'll see them at 2/3 of an acre or half an acre. And then the second thing is the horizontal wells that are installed nowadays as the lifts are being built to capture gas when it's first created. Typically, older landfills, you waited until an area was full, and then you stuck the vertical wells in and then started to suck off the gas. Nowadays, you put in horizontal collectors before you actually insert the vertical wells. So tightening that up even more is a way to increase that. And I believe that's what Ned was talking about. There's a number of new wells that are about to vertical wells. Vertical wells that are about to go online now. And that will help tremendously.
I would have to concur, the number one, that the odors are far worse recently. And so while I appreciate the study and I hear that it was done, in the most conservative way, and it's somewhat reassuring to me, but the quality of life issue is not to be underestimated. And the smell is really, it's really offensive, and it also does enter your home. It's not just when you go outside. And it is worse lately. And so, I also kind of want to cut to the chase, and I want to know a little bit about, I just want to know what's gonna make it better, and can it be reduced right now, soon? Can it be reduced? And do we have any hope that it will be better, that the odor will be better? And I appreciate the results of the study, and I'd love to believe that there's absolutely no health risk. I'm not afraid I'm going to die in the next 5 years because of the smell, but I worry. You just smell something, you worry. And so I do want to know, really very simply, what's going to make it better? Is it going to get better? Is there any possibility that we won't have to wake up every day, go outside and smell this?
First of all, I want to re-acknowledge that we understand it's a quality of life issue. We're working the best we can to control the odor. We didn't want to present information to folks tonight about impacts to human health, but quality of life is in many ways as important to potential risks to human health, and we realize that. I can't respond. I haven't lived in town that long, so the level of odor that people have experienced going back to the previous woman's comments to 19 years, I can't really speak to the odors over time and whether it's worse now than it was before. Based on the odor logs that we keep at the Public Works Department, we realize that we do get a number of calls from people in various directions around the landfill. So we realize that there is a problem, that there is a quality of life issue. We're working on, I think, one of the installation of these gas wells and the other gas improvements that Ned described a few minutes ago. We feel are really will be effective. We're talking to the state. We felt that it was going to take a couple of weeks to see these improvements and increased vacuum draw on the collection wells out there. One thing I think that will make even more improvement is capping that we'll do this summer. As Ned had mentioned, we have about 8 acres of uncapped area at the landfill. A lot of the odors that people smell are released through surface emissions from uncapped parts of the landfill. So we're looking at capping about 5 acres, which is the majority of the open area that we have, and that is really going to be there'll be immediate improvement once that happens. These gas wells that we're putting in, the other types of gas collection work that we're doing in the active area, these take a little bit of time to see the effects. They're not instantaneous. They're nowhere near as quick as we would like to see. We don't like having to respond to folks that are being inconvenienced and aggrieved by the landfill. We certainly, this is something we're working the hardest as we can on it. We're working to get these capping plans out for bidding for construction so we can get this work done as soon as possible. Everything that the city is doing, we're trying to stay ahead of it. We're trying to be as proactive as possible. Everything that we're doing is being overseen, and we're being pushed even further by DEP. They're watching everything that we're asking to do. They're approving quickly. They're asking us to do things that we may not have thought of, or asked us to plan in advance to move ahead of it, try to get ahead of it. So we're hoping that the gas wells that we install within a couple of weeks, there'll be a noticeable difference. If there isn't, We've been talking to the department about doing other things like interim capping, other activities, bringing more cover soil out there. We're gonna stay at it until we don't have to have meetings like this, and we're hoping them to be sooner than later. And thank you for the succinct question.